Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Weston here. You find me out here in a shady spot in my garden with a good book that I thought I'd start to read to you. You might be able to hear some birdsong or people or some traffic. I'm hoping it's not going to be too distracting for you and that you're going to enjoy this story. I've chosen Charlotte's Web. It's a story of a girl called Fern who loves a little pig called Wilbur, and of how Wilbur is saved from a dreadful fate by Charlotte the Spider's very clever plan. Chapter 1 is called Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs, it's a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it, just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. A pitcher is another word for a jug. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed her chair out the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping wet by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you are going to have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of piglets than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now, run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is quite another." "I see no difference," replied Fern. Here's a picture of them squabbling over the axe. "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to that axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I have ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back into the house, and I will bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you raise it with a bottle, like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelt of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arable, and Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink, washed his hand, and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs, her eyes red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton. There inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was the white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arable, "saved from an untimely death, and may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Look at him," she whispered. "Oh, he's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father, and then she kissed her mother. Then she opened the lid again, lifted the pig out and held it against her cheek. And now at this moment her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed, an air rifle in one hand and a wood dagger in the other. "What's that?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" "She's got a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arable. "Now wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery, setting his gun down. "You call that miserable thing a pig?" "That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a rat." "Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be here in half an hour." "Can I have a pig too, Pop?" asked Avery. "No, I only distribute pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arable. "Fern was up at daylight trying to rid the world of injustice. As a result, she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nevertheless a pig. It just goes to show what can happen if a person gets out of bed promptly." Excuse the noisy motorbike. "Let's eat," said Dad. But Fern, she couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle and a rubber teat. She poured warm water into the bottle, fitted the teat over the top and gave it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, and Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a doughnut in her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another doughnut. The children ran out to the road and climbed onto the bus. Fern took no notice of the others on the bus. She just sat and stared out of the window, thinking what a blissful world it was. Here she is, feeding her little piglet. She stared out of the window, thinking what a blissful world it was, and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "What would you call a pet pig?" "Its name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself, "and I'm betting none of you chose Wilbur for a pig's name." She was still thinking about the pig when her teacher said, "Fern, what is the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern dreamily. The pupils giggled and she blushed. Chapter 2. It's called Wilbur. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, feed him and put him to bed. Every morning as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feed around noontime each day when Fern was away in school. Wilbur loved his milk, but he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand up and gaze at her with adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. Then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard specially for Wilbur under an apple tree and gave him a large wooden box full of straw, with a doorway cut in it so he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," said her father. "You just watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily to the box. Fern peered through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout, his nose. In a short time, he had managed to dig a tunnel in the straw. Here's a picture of his little home. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. Fern was enchanted. It relieved her mind to know that her baby would sleep covered up and was going to stay warm. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road with Fern and waited with her till the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it vanished round a turn. While Fern was still in school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she'd take him out and he would follow her around the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur would go too. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would wait at the bottom step until she came down again. If she took her doll for a walk in the doll carriage, Wilbur followed along. Sometimes, on these journeys, Wilbur would get tired, so Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage alongside the doll. Now, this book was written quite a long time ago, so the word carriage might be unfamiliar to you. Perhaps you can work out from what's just happened in the story what we would call a doll carriage. Give you a moment to think about it. We would call it a doll's pram, right? Now, he liked being carried in the carriage, and if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked so cute when his eyes were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly, very smoothly, so she didn't wake her infants. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery, remember that's her brother, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down the brook for a swim. A couple more old-fashioned words there. A bathing suit, what would we call that? And what about a brook? Do you understand the word brook? It's another word for a stream, smaller than a river. Now, Wilbur tagged along at Fern's heels. When she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in too. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking, so while the children swam and played and splashed water each other, Wilbur amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and oozy. I'm not sure I would find that mud very delightful. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers called a spring pig, which simply means that he was born in springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell, and he was going to have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept, but her father was firm about this. And at the bottom of this page, just to help you imagine that doll carriage, Wilbur's appetite had increased. He was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to the milk. Mr. Arable was not willing to provide for him any longer. He had already sold Wilbur's brothers and sisters. He's got to go, Fern. You have had fun raising your baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer, and he has got to be sold. Call up the Zuckermans, suggested Mrs. Arable to Fern. Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can just walk down the road and visit him often as you like. How much money should I ask for him? Fern wanted to know. Well, said her father, he is a runt. Tell your Uncle Homer you've got a pig that you'll sell for $6 and just see what he says. It was soon arranged. Fern phoned and got her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith hollered for Uncle Homer, and Uncle Homer came in from the barn and talked to Fern. When he heard that the price was only $6, he said he would buy that pig. So the next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in a manure pile in the cellar of the Zuckerman's barn. Now, we've had 2 clues in the story, 2 words that should tell you which country this is set in. One of them was dollars. Now, which country do you know uses dollars? Okay, you've got it. America, yeah. So what was the other word we heard the author, E.B. White, use that is an Americanism, American word? Some of you might have that already. Some of you might need a clue. It was another word for shoes or trainers. If you got sneakers, great job. That's another really big clue that this story is not set in England. And it's also the end of chapter 2. But we'll carry on, shall we? Because chapter 3 is rather excitingly called Escape. What do you think's going to happen? So, the barn, the Zuckerman's barn, was large and it was very old. It smelled of hay and it smelled of manure. It smelled of perspiration of tired horses and the wonderful sweet breath of patient cows. Perspiration being another word for sweat. Not a very nice place. It did often have a peaceful sort of smell, as though nothing bad could happen ever again in the world. It smelled of grain and of harness dressing. That's the harness that a horse would wear. And of axle grease. Axle is part of a cart. And of rubber boots. It even smelled of new rope. Whenever the cat was given some fish to eat, the barn would smell of fish. Really not very nice smells. But mostly it smelt of hay, for there was always hay in the great loft above. And there was always hay being pitched down to the cows and the horses and the sheep. The barn was pleasantly warm in winter, when the animals spent most of their time indoors, and it was pleasantly cool in summer, when the big doors stood wide open to the breeze. The barn had stalls on the main floor for the work horses, tie-ups on the main floor for the cows, a sheepfold down below for the sheep, and a pig pen down below for Wilbur. It was full of all sorts of things that you find in barns. Ladders, grindstones, can you work out what they might be for? Pitchforks, monkey wrenches, that's a kind of tool, nothing to do with monkeys, I assure you. Scythes, they are used for cutting tall grasses. Lawn mowers, snow shovels, axe handles, milk pails, water buckets, empty grain sacks, even rusty rat traps. It was the kind of barn that swallows like to build their nests in. It was the kind of barn that children like to play in. And the whole thing was earned by Fern's uncle, Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman. Wilbur's home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows. Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile is a good place to keep a young pig. Pigs needed warmth, and it was warm and comfortable down there in the barn cellar on the south side. Here he is outside of his barn, just having a roam. Fern came almost every day to visit him. She found an old milking stool that had been discarded, and she placed the stool in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly during the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. And we'll leave the story there for now. Here she is. We'll pick it up again tomorrow and find out quite what the escape is all about. Till then, bye for now.